The desert stretched wide beneath a burning sky, painted gold and crimson by the setting sun. Wind carried the scent of dry sage and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote cried into the emptiness. It was a land both harsh and beautiful, where life and death seemed to walk hand in hand. In that wild silence broken only by the restless breeze, two worlds met. One belonged to the people who had roamed these lands for centuries, their lives bound to the rhythm of the earth. The other belonged to those who came from far beyond the horizon, bringing their own hunger for land, for power, for survival. She had grown up hearing stories of the Apache, stories whispered by firelight, painted with fear and warning. Her people called them enemies, raiders, shadows in the night who struck without mercy. Yet standing before one of them now, she saw not a shadow, but a man of flesh and strength, carved by the desert itself. His eyes were as dark as storm clouds, unreadable, unyielding, but in their depth flickered something she could not name. She should have been afraid. She should have turned away. But her heart beat louder than her fear. He towered over her, skin bronzed by the relentless sun, his chest bare, scarred from battles both won and lost. Black braids framed his face, and his expression was hard, as if carved from stone. Yet when the wind shifted, when their eyes met, she felt her breath catch in her throat. It was madness, she told herself. Madness to stand so close, to feel her pulse race in his presence. Madness to want something she could not have. The desert had taught her to endure, to obey, to survive. But it had also taught her the cruelty of silence, the loneliness of waiting for a tomorrow that might never come. And so, when she found herself face to face with him, she could no longer silence the voice inside her. It rose like a storm, shaking her from within. "Make me yours tonight," she whispered, her words trembling as much as her hands. They hung in the dry air between them, fragile, dangerous, like sparks waiting to set fire to the desert. For a moment, he did not move. His jaw tightened, his gaze piercing hers, as if weighing every hidden truth behind her plea. She knew the history written between them. His people and hers had clashed in blood and fire, families torn apart, lands claimed and reclaimed. Every law of reason, every rule of loyalty, told her to stay away. But the heart has no rules, and desire pays no mind to reason. He stepped closer, the earth itself seeming to shift beneath his weight. She could hear his breathing now, steady, controlled, yet edged with something fierce. His hand hovered near hers, close enough that the heat of his skin reached her. She wanted him to touch her. She wanted the world to fall away until there was only this moment, only him. But he held back. His silence was heavier than the desert night that would soon descend. She could not read him, could not know if he despised her plea, or if he fought the same fire that consumed her. The sun sank lower behind the mesas, shadows stretching long across the land, wrapping them both in fading light. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat louder than the last. She thought of her people, of the stories she had been told, of the dangers that lay ahead if anyone discovered her here. She thought of him, of the strength in his arms, of the unspoken promise in his gaze. And still, she did not take back her words. The desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting. She wondered if he would turn away, if he would vanish into the wilderness like smoke on the horizon, leaving her with only regret and the memory of this forbidden moment. Or would he stay, breaking every boundary drawn by war and fear, answering the plea she could no longer silence? The wind stirred again, tugging at her hair, whispering through the canyons. He reached out at last, his fingers brushing against her arm, with a touch so light it felt like fire. Her breath caught, her body frozen between hope and fear. Yet in his eyes she saw the storm gather. A decision lingered there, one that could change both their lives forever, and in that fragile heartbeat of silence, the world seemed to teeter on the edge of something unknown, something dangerous, something more powerful than either of them could control. Would he claim her, as she pleaded? Or would the desert swallow their moment, leaving them both with nothing but shadows and unanswered desire? The answer hung unspoken, carried away with the wind, as darkness began to fall. The night fell quickly over the desert, covering the mesas and valleys in layers of shadow and silver light. The stars came alive above, sharp and endless, like watchful eyes staring down at the earth. She stood close to him, feeling the weight of his presence as if the air itself grew thicker around him. His hand still lingered near hers, yet he had not taken it fully, had not crossed that final distance. The silence between them was louder than any words, carrying with it all the history that bound their worlds apart. She wanted to speak again, to push him, to demand an answer to the plea she had already given. But something in his face kept her quiet. A warning that this was not a man who could be forced. She thought of the path that had brought her here, into the desert, away from her people, and into the reach of a man she had been raised to fear. Her family had always spoken of the Apache with bitterness. To them, he was part of a people who lived outside the laws of settlers, struck without warning and vanished into the wilderness before the dust had settled. Yet now, she wondered if those stories had been painted only in anger, told by voices that never sought to understand. Because what she saw before her was not a shadow or a monster. He was a man carved by this land, one who carried a strength her own people could not match, because they had never lived so close to the heart of the earth. He did not speak at first, but his eyes never left hers. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was deep, low, carrying the roughness of someone who had learned to speak little but mean every word. "You should not be here," he said. It was not a threat, but a warning. His gaze drifted past her, scanning the horizon as if danger could rise at any moment from the empty desert floor. She wanted to tell him that she knew the risk, that she had walked into this willingly, but the truth was harder than that. She had come not only for him, but to escape the life she had always known. The walls of her settlement felt too small, the rules too heavy. Every day she felt the weight of duty pressing on her shoulders, the endless waiting for a life that never felt like her own. Here, in the vast wild where his people lived, she felt the breath of freedom. And though she barely knew him, though they stood on opposite sides of a war older than both of them, she could not deny the pull she felt toward him. He turned away for a moment, looking out at the mesas where moonlight draped over stone like silver cloth. She wondered what he saw in that endless horizon. Perhaps he saw danger, or perhaps he saw memories she could never know. When he faced her again, his expression was unreadable, but his words cut through the quiet. "If your people find you here, they will not forgive you. If mine find you, they may not spare you." She swallowed hard, her heart beating faster. He spoke the truth, and she knew it. But something inside her refused to turn back. She lifted her chin, her voice steady, though her body trembled. "I am not afraid." The corner of his mouth tightened, though it was not quite a smile. More like disbelief, or perhaps respect. "Fear keeps you alive," he said softly. "Do not throw it away." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from far away. She caught it too, and he narrowed his eyes. He listened to the land the way no one from her settlement ever had. Every change in the air, every cry of a bird, every silence in the night seemed to speak to him. She realized then that his people's strength was not only in their weapons or their skill in battle, but in how deeply they were tied to this place. The desert was not their enemy. It was their shield, their teacher, their blood, as the night grew colder. He finally stepped back, though the space between them felt heavier now than before. He studied her again, as if deciding whether to leave her or guide her. She wanted him to choose the latter, wanted him to see that she was not his enemy, even if her people were. Her thoughts turned back to her settlement. She imagined the stern face of her father, who had warned her never to stray beyond the safe paths. She thought of her mother, who carried worry in her eyes, but rarely spoke it aloud. They had raised her to follow, to obey, to never question. Yet the more she thought of them, the more she realized she could not go back to that life without knowing what this path before her could mean. The Apache warrior finally spoke again, his tone sharper this time. "Why did you come?" The question burned in her chest, for she did not know if she could answer honestly. She could tell him that she came because of the stories, because she wanted to see if the shadows were real. She could tell him she came because the walls of her world were too small. But the truth that pressed most heavily was the one she could not speak aloud. Not yet. That she came because of him, because something in his presence had already changed her. Her silence lingered too long, and his eyes hardened. She felt the distance growing between them again. He began to turn, as if he might walk away into the desert and vanish forever. Panic rose in her chest, stronger than fear, stronger than pride. She stepped forward quickly, her hand reaching toward him. "Wait," she whispered, her voice breaking through the night air. He stopped, but did not face her right away. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of his decision. When he finally looked back, his face was shadowed, his eyes glinting in the faint light. "If you stay with me," he said, "you will not return the same." Her breath caught, her pulse racing, as she searched his face. She knew he meant more than just her safety. He meant that her heart, her mind, perhaps even her soul, would not belong to the world she had left behind. She knew it, and still she could not turn away. Behind them, the cry of a night bird echoed through the canyon, sharp and lonely. The desert stretched endlessly, as if daring her to choose. She stood between two worlds, each pulling her in different directions. And she knew that whichever path she chose, there would be no turning back. And as the stars burned brighter above them, as his gaze held hers like a challenge and a promise, she felt the world shift beneath her feet, carrying her toward a future she could not yet see, but one she could no longer resist. The moment was fragile, suspended in the darkness, yet in it lay the weight of everything to come, every danger, every secret, every desire that could not be spoken aloud. She did not know if he would guide her deeper into his world, or leave her standing in the silence of the desert night. But she knew that the choice, whatever it was, would mark the beginning of something neither of them could escape, and as the wind whispered once more across the empty land, she felt the cliff edge beneath her heart, waiting for the step that would decide everything before dawn. The warrior led her across the open flats where sage brushed their legs, and the sky turned from purple to pale gray. He moved like part of the land, sure and silent. She followed close, keeping the cold out with a blanket he had given her. The chill bit her fingers, but her thoughts burned hotter than any fire. Behind them, the settlement slept, and ahead lay the country of the Apache. A sweep of broken stone, dry riverbeds, and juniper slopes where a rider could hide in plain sight. The old American West was alive in the hush of hooves and the far cry of a hawk. She tried to count her steps, to press fear back into a corner, yet each step only carried her deeper into the unknown. When the sun pushed up, slow and patient, he halted by a low ridge. From there they could see a small valley shaped like a bowl. Smoke curled from 3 hidden fires. Men, women, and children moved between canvas shelters and brush huts. Horses cropped grass near the creek. This was not the enemy camp of bedtime stories. It was a living place, worn and mended by use. The warrior lifted a hand as if to ask for quiet, then guided her down a narrow path cut by water long gone. At the valley floor, eyes turned. No one shouted, but the air tightened. A boy ran to warn the elders. A woman wrapped a baby closer and watched with rigid shoulders. An old man held a stick with feathers tied to it and stood with calm that felt older than the mountains. The warrior spoke in his own tongue. He did not touch her, but his body stood like a wall between her and the stairs. She understood none of the words, but she heard the steady rhythm of his voice. The old man listened without moving, then flicked his gaze to her. He spoke a few words in slow English learned from traders. "You crossed the river. You ask shelter? Shelter holds a price." She nodded and did not look away. "I ask protection," she said. "I will not harm." The old man lifted the feathered stick, then set it down. His meaning was plain. Stay until night. After that, decisions. They gave her water and a flat cake of corn. A girl no older than 12 stared at her boots, then at the pale skin of her wrist, then hid a smile behind her hand. Men checked the horses and took quiet turns guarding the ridge. The warrior stayed near, speaking little. He was not feared here. He was respected like a flint blade that had never failed in winter. When the old man at last drew them both into the shade of a cottonwood, He spoke long in his own language and then said in English, "There is danger. Your people searched the southern trail at dawn. Soldiers ride from the fort. A traitor talks too much." The warrior's jaw tightened, and the old man added, "If the soldiers come here, no one walks away without bleeding." The main conflict stood naked in the sunlight. Settlement against camp. Uniform against paint. Wagons and fences against old paths. She felt it like a rope pulling both arms at once. She knew her father would gather men and ride with rifles if he thought she had been taken. He would call it rescue. The warrior's people would call it an invasion. Between those words, a spark waited for wind. By afternoon, the wind came. A scout arrived from the north line with dust on his hair and a breath so hard he nearly collapsed. He spoke fast. The old man looked to the warrior and then to her. "Soldiers, many." The warrior turned to her at last. "They will not listen to you," he said. "They will count you as a reason to shoot." She thought of her father's temper and the fear that always sat like a second person at his table. He would fire first and speak later. She closed her eyes, then opened them with a new steadiness. "I need to talk to them before they see your camp. Show me a place where I can intercept them." The old man measured her with eyes that carried storms and drought and the birth of children who now had children of their own. He looked to the warrior. "If she goes, you go." They rode the north ridge, staying in the shelter of rocks. In the wash below, fresh tracks cut the sand. She could see where a shod horse slipped on a stone, where a wagon wheel once bit deep. Those marks were part of her world. Yet the ridgeline, where a single thorn tree bent from years of wind, belonged to the warrior's world. The line between them ran along her spine. Near midday, they reached a high saddle and reined in. In the far distance, a column moved through a gap, sunlight flashing on metal. Bluecoats at the front, a guide at their side. Her breath caught. She knew the guide. He was a trader who brought tobacco and cheap knives to the settlement and rumors to the fort. He had a way of smiling with no warmth in it. The warrior opened a leather pouch and took out a small polished mirror. He angled it toward a ridge beyond them. A flick of light answered. She realized he had signaled to another scout unseen by the army. The land itself served as a telegraph, one mesa sending word to the next. The old American frontier was not an empty map. It was a web of sightlines and memory. They looped down into a dry canyon where the rock walls climbed on each side like the ribs of a giant beast. Here, sound carried in narrow lines. If the soldiers passed along the lower wash, she could call to them without being exposed to every rifle in the column. The warrior tied his horse and moved ahead on foot, placing his moccasins where the sand would not hold a print. When he returned, he said, "They will be here soon. If you speak, choose words that lead them away." She nodded, though her throat clenched. He studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing it. "If they do not listen," he said, "run back up the notch and do not turn." His eyes held more than warning, but he added nothing else. She watched him slip into a cleft in the stone, becoming shadow. The first riders came into view, moving slow, while the guide pointed with his whip. She cupped her hands and called to them, voice echoing along the rock. The guide spun in his saddle. The bluecoats tensed. She stepped out from behind a boulder, hands raised, feet set wide so she would not stumble. They recognized her at once. A corporal pulled his horse alongside the guide. The officer in charge rode forward. "What are you doing out here, miss?" His tone was clipped. The guide's eyes glittered. She kept her voice calm. "I left the settlement to look for a stray. I saw a sign of raiders in the south and wanted to warn you. If you keep to the wash, you will miss them. They moved east." The officer studied her. The guide cut in, sharp as a spur. "She is lying." She turned on him before fear could catch up. "You sold watered whiskey and brittle knives to my neighbor, then bragged about it behind his back. Are you so sure of truth now?" A few soldiers smirked. The guide's face tightened. The officer held up a hand for silence. "If there are tracks east, we will see them." He sent 2 riders forward. Her stomach included a knot tight enough to crack stone. If they found nothing, they would push north, straight toward the hidden valley. The wind rose, lifting dust. The warrior waited in stone silence above. She felt both worlds listening. Minutes stretched until the riders returned. One raised an arm and pointed east. The wash below the eastern mesa shows movement. Could be a decoy, sir? The officer frowned and looked back toward the narrow gap to the north. He weighed a map that existed only in his head. He did not want to miss a chance to surprise the Apache. He also did not want to ride into a blind pocket and lose men. At last he made a choice that was not for her, or for the warrior, or for the old man in the valley. It was for the story he would tell his superior, and for the line of ink on the fort's report. We follow the east sign. If we see no camp by dusk, we turn north again. The column moved. Her knees weakened so fast, she had to lean on the boulder. The guide gave her a stare that promised he would remember this. When the soldiers passed, the warrior slid down to her side with barely a ripple of sound. His eyes carried a question. She could not answer it. She could only breathe. He lifted his chin toward the notch. We go back. He set a steady pace that let the fear drain without leaving her empty. On the return, he checked high ground and low ground with the same patience he used to string a bow. She thought of the difference between hunting and raiding, between protecting and provoking. The words used in the settlement, words like raid and rescue and treaty, suddenly felt thin as smoke. Here, choices shaped lives more than words did. Back in the valley, the old man heard the account and nodded without praise. He set 2 more watchers on the ridges and called for food to be shared quickly. No waste. The camp moved with the quiet of people who had done this many times. Children carried water. Men checked bowstrings and the short carbines they had taken from past fights. Women bound hair tight and spoke in low voices. The girl who had stared at the pale skin offered the woman a strip of leather to tie her hair. Small kindness in a day of sharp edges. As the sun lowered, a different trouble entered the story. A runner arrived from a distant family. He reported that cattle from the settlement had grazed the only green patch along the creek near their winter huts. The animals had trampled the corn bed. A fence post had been planted on a path used by elders to reach a burial hill. The runner's hands shook from anger as much as from the long miles. The old man listened without hurry. He asked questions. He turned to the warrior. Take 2 men. Go in the dark. Move the cattle off the water. Cut no fence. Leave sign that warns but does not insult. If anyone follows, lose them in the rocks. The woman heard this and felt the coil tighten again. She knew who kept those cattle. Her father did. He called that creek a gift from hard work. He would not take well to any hand but his own, pushing his herd. Yet the winter huts and the burial hill were older than the grass. The valley held more than bodies tonight. It held old claims, older pain, and the heat of pride on both sides. The warrior chose his 2 companions. One, a young hunter with quick feet. The other, a broad man with a laugh that did not show itself today. He told the woman to stay in the valley. She wanted to argue, but the old man's gaze held her quiet. You are a bridge now, he said in English, as if the words had been kept for this precise use. Bridges break if they run everywhere. She accepted the truth, even as it felt like a cage. She watched the warrior leave, his figure thinning to a stripe against the last light. Night took hold. Coyotes moved like ideas over the hills. The camp was dark and ready. She sat by a bank of willow and thought of a child's toy left on her bed in the settlement, and then of the polished mirror in the warrior's pouch. 2 small things that belonged to 2 different worlds. Her chest ached at the thought that she might lose both. Close to midnight, a rustle came along the willow bank. The girl from before slid beside her. The child did not speak English well, but tried with care. Why you come here? The woman answered as honestly as she could. I did not want to live in fear. The girl looked puzzled. Fear of what? Fear of hating people I do not know, the woman said. The girl thought a long time, then said, My mother says fear is a kettle. If you always keep it over the fire, it boils away the water you need. Then her eyes lifted sharply to the ridge. A signal winked in the dark like a star fallen to the earth. 2. Pause. 1. The girl stood. Men rose without a sound. The old man lifted the feathered stick and pointed to the western edge. Something had changed. A scout hurried down the slope to the old man and spoke. The old man's face hardened. He said for all to hear in English, "A small group of settlers ride to the winter huts. Not soldiers. Angry men. Carry ropes and rifles." The woman's throat went dry. Angry men meant her father and the neighbors who followed his voice when whiskey and pride were poured from the same jug. The old man looked at her. "The warrior is not back yet. If the angry men find him driving cattle off the water, blood will follow the creek to the river." The decision came swift. The old man sent 2 riders to warn the warrior and set a line of watchers along the flats. He did not plan for a charge. He planned for a narrow path out if the worst arrived. He turned to the woman. "If they see you with us, they will forget words. If they see you alone, they may listen enough to slow their hands." Her legs felt numb, yet she stood. For the first time, she did not feel pulled in 2 directions. She felt pushed to a single place where she belonged. Whether she liked it or not, they gave her a small white cloth to tie to a stick. In the dark, white meant truce. She climbed the ridge with the girl at her side until the old man sent the child back with a touch to her shoulder. On the high ground, the wind pressed against her face like a hard palm. She moved toward the western flats where she could already make out the neat shape of riders. Their horses tossed heads. The men carried rifles across their laps. She knew the set of one broad pair of shoulders and the tilt of one hat. Her father rode at the front. She stepped out before they reached the narrow stretch of ground where the flats narrowed to a funnel. She lifted the white cloth. The riders slowed, hooves thudding like drums. Her father's voice shot out, raw and hot. "Get behind me. We take our cattle back and run those raiders off the creek." She did not move. The men shifted, uneasy. Her father's eyes cut to the ridges and caught dark shapes that could be rock or riders. He grew more certain in his fury. "You brought them here? You shame this family." The words hit like thrown stones. She stood her ground and spoke with a steadiness she did not know she owned. "The winter huts are there. The burial hill is there. Move the herd to the lower bend, and no one needs to point a gun." Her father spat in the dust. "They stole from us. They stole the night you were born." He raised his rifle as if memory itself had a body to shoot. Before anyone could answer, a new line of riders appeared on the far edge. The warrior and his 2 companions drove the cattle at a controlled pace. They were not stealing. They were guiding, keeping the animals from breaking bones on rocks. The scene froze for a breath. On one side, settlers tight with rage. On the other, 3 figures, astride painted ponies, calm and ready. Between them, the creek and the cattle and the reaching arms of the willow. Every heart in that stretch of land beat at the same speed. The warrior's eyes found hers across the distance. He saw the rifle in her father's hands and the white cloth in hers. He lifted his palm, not to her but to everyone. A small piece. A small request. The old man's watchers shifted in the dark like the turning of a page. Somewhere a horse snorted. Somewhere a child woke and asked for water. The old American knight listened. Her father's finger moved on the trigger. The guide from the army was not here to twist words, but his spirit might as well have been living in the heat of old blame. The woman took 1 step forward, then another. She lowered the white cloth and raised both hands, not to surrender, but to be seen by every eye. She began to speak, picking each word like a stone set in a crossing over a deep river. She spoke of fences and paths, of water that could be shared, of burial hills and winter huts, of hungry children and tired horses, of how the land was big enough for more than one law if men chose patience over pride. Her voice did not shake. A gust rose and scattered her words across the flats. For a moment, no one moved. Then a rifle cracked, not at a body, but into the air. It was a settler at the back whose nerves had frayed until his hands betrayed him. The sound burst like lightning in a dry forest. Horses reared. Men shouted. The cattle bawled and surged toward the creek, crowding the narrow bank. The warrior spurred to cut them off from the deeper water, and the two companions flanked him with skill, but panic ran faster than training. The woman watched chaos unfold in the same heartbeat that carried everything she had tried to hold in balance. She was close enough to see her father's eyes burn with a mix of terror and love and stubborn pride. She was close enough to see the warrior's shoulders coil, to see his hand reach for the short carbine at his side, only to hold there, fighting the pull of the moment. On the ridge above, the old man's feathered stick lifted and fell, sending a signal she could not read. And the night, as if it had waited years for this 1 second, bent around them all and held its breath, ready to break with either mercy or blood. The gunshot still echoed across the flats, bouncing off the rock walls like a ghost that refused to vanish. Horses reared and screamed, men shouted over each other, and the cattle surged forward in blind panic, hooves tearing into the earth. The dust rose thick, choking the air, and through it all she stood in the open with her hands raised, watching the fragile line between peace and blood snap under the weight of fear. Her father shouted for his men to hold steady, but his own rifle stayed raised, his jaw locked tight with rage. On the far side, the warrior steadied his horse and cut across the stampede, guiding the herd back from the creek with sharp calls in his language. His two companions rode hard beside him, the dust painting their faces in streaks of ash and grit. Every second felt stretched, each heartbeat louder than the last. She knew one wrong move, one more shot, fired would set fire to everything. The cattle hit the edge of the creek, splashing mud and water high into the air. Some stumbled, nearly dragged under by the crush, but the warrior forced his mount into the chaos, swinging his carbine without firing, and driving the herd toward shallower ground. His bravery stunned her, yet she also knew how it looked to the settlers. To them, it was a savage charge. To his people, it was protection. To her, it was the edge of a blade that could cut either way. Her father's eyes found hers in the dust-choked twilight. He saw her standing between his riders and the warrior. His voice cut through the uproar, raw and furious. "Get away from them now." The words struck harder than the shot had, as if he could strip her loyalty with the sound alone. But she did not move. Her feet held to the earth, rooted by something stronger than fear. She shook her head slowly, hoping he would see not rebellion, but truth. He did not. His finger tightened again on the trigger. Before he could fire, one of his men grabbed his arm, pulling the barrel aside. "Not yet," the man urged. "We shoot now, we lose cattle, maybe lose all." Her father snarled, but for a breath, his rage was checked. She used that breath, raising her voice as high as she could above the storm. "The herd is safe. Look at them. They're being pushed back, not stolen. Don't turn this into war." Some settlers wavered, darting between her and the cattle now climbing the far bank under the warrior's control. But others, men who had lost brothers or friends in past raids, saw only a chance for revenge. One spat into the dust and muttered, "A bullet now saves a raid later." The sound of his hammer pulling back split the air like the hiss of a snake. The warrior must have heard it too. He wheeled his horse sharply and raised his carbine, though he still did not fire. His dark eyes fixed on her father's riders, with a promise if the shot came, he would answer. She saw the tension in his arms, the way his hand hovered with deadly certainty. The air between them all was stretched like a rope pulled to breaking. Then came another sound, sharp and strange, a whistle cutting through the chaos. On the ridge above, figures appeared, half-shadowed in the fading light. Apache riders. A dozen at least. They had been waiting, watching, unseen, until now. The old man had sent for them when the cattle were first moved, and now they rode down the slope with bows strung. Arrows knocked, rifles carried loose, but ready. Their arrival was like thunder breaking a storm wide open. The settlers cursed and jerked their horses around, rifles lifting higher. Her father's face went pale beneath the dust. "They're all here," he spat, his fury twisting into fear. "You see, girl? You led us into their trap." Her stomach turned at his words, though she had expected them. She had begged for time, for patience, but to him, every shadow confirmed his anger. She wanted to shout that this was no trap, that the Apache riders had come only to protect their people, not to slaughter. But her voice felt small against the weight of years of hatred and blood. The warrior signaled sharply, and his riders spread wide, cutting off any chance of the settlers escaping back through the flats without crossing open ground. The cattle had been pushed aside, but the men were now trapped in a circle of dust, water, and fury. She moved forward quickly, planting herself between both sides once more. Her father shouted her name, his voice cracking, not with weakness, but with a kind of grief that came out sounding like rage. "Get back before I lose you for good." He meant it. She saw it in the way his eyes burned and softened all at once. He would rather drag her home in chains than watch her stay here. But she also saw the warrior's face. Calm but fierce, his eyes locked on her as if she was the only bridge left in a canyon too wide to cross. His people waited for his command. He waited for hers. The old man's voice echoed in her memory. "You are a bridge now." Bridges break if they run everywhere. The cattle shifted again, restless. The smell of sweat and dust filled her lungs. The riders on both sides gripped their weapons, hands trembling from the strain of holding back. The air seemed to hum with the nearness of violence. Then the guide appeared. She had almost forgotten him, but he rode hard from the south trail, his dust caked thick on his face, his smile wide and cruel, even in the failing light. He carried no flag of truce, only a rifle raised high. He shouted to the settlers, "They're waiting for you to break. One shot, and they'll scatter like dogs." His voice poured poison over the fragile ground they all stood upon. Her father's men looked at him, desperate for certainty, for someone to tell them their anger was righteous. The guide gave them that. He pointed at the warrior and sneered. "That one is their leader. Kill him, and the rest will run." Her heart lurched. And before she thought, she cried out, "No." Her voice cracked through the dust and silence like glass breaking. Every head turned to her. The guide's smile faltered. Her father's face twisted in confusion and betrayal. The warrior's jaw tightened. She raised her hands higher, stepping forward until she stood in the very center of the narrow ground, visible to both sides. "If you fire," she said, voice shaking but strong, "then neither side wins. You lose cattle, they lose lives, and I am lost with them all." Her eyes locked on her father's. "Is that the story you want to tell the world? That you killed your own child to keep a fence standing?" The words cut him. She could see it. But his pride and grief wrestled in his face, pulling him in two directions at once. He raised his rifle higher, trembling, his lips moving around words he could not yet speak. The warrior spurred forward a few steps, his horse rearing, dust swirling around him. His voice thundered in his own tongue, words she could not understand but felt in her bones. His people cried out in answer, stamping hooves and rattling weapons. The guide cursed and raised his own rifle, aiming straight at the warrior's chest. Time slowed. She saw the steel gleam, saw the warrior's eyes steady and unflinching, saw her father torn between duty and blood. She felt the ground itself waiting for the shot, waiting for the spark that would ignite everything. The cattle bawled and surged once more, crashing against each other, hooves splitting the mud. Water sprang into the air. Horses screamed, men shouted, and still no shot came. The moment stretched so thin, it was ready to tear. Her breath burned in her chest, her throat raw, her body frozen between two worlds. And in that heartbeat, the night held every answer unspoken, every fate waiting to fall, as the trigger of one rifle began to pull. The rifle fired, its thunder splitting the night, but the shot went wide. The horse beneath the guide bucked hard, throwing him sideways as the weapon cracked skyward instead of into the warrior's chest. Dust exploded around him as he hit the ground, his weapon tumbling into the water at the creek's edge. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos broke again, not with bullets, but with voices. Men shouted, horses twisted, cattle stumbled through the shallows. Yet the single missed shot changed everything. The killing blow had not come, and with that, fragile chance remained. Her father lowered his rifle with trembling hands, his eyes burning as he looked at her. He saw her still standing in the middle of the flats, her face streaked with dust. Her arms lifted not to fight but to hold the last thread of peace together. The sight of her there, refusing to step aside, cracked something in him that anger could not cover. He had spent his life fighting to protect his family, his land, his name. But now, staring at her, he saw that the fight itself might cost him the very thing he claimed to guard. The warrior moved his horse forward slowly, each step measured, calm but firm. He did not raise his weapon. He lifted his hand open, palm out, a gesture of strength that carried no threat. His people held back at his signal, their arrows still nocked, their rifles still loaded, but none fired. Across from them, the settlers shifted uneasily. Their anger cooled by confusion, their courage drained by the guide's fall. Without his urging, they seemed less certain, and less willing to throw their lives into the dust. Her father looked between the warrior and his daughter, the tension in him a storm that had nowhere left to go. At last, he spat into the dirt and lowered his rifle fully. He growled at his men, "Take the herd. Drive them back to the bend. We've made our point." His voice was sharp, but it was not the call to war it had been before. The men obeyed with relief, turning their horses toward the cattle and steering them slowly away from the burial hill in the winter. Huts the warrior gave a short command in his own tongue, and his riders eased their stance, watching but not pressing. The air shifted. The rope stretched between the two sides had not snapped after all, though it quivered under the weight of distrust. She exhaled shakily, her hands falling at last, for the first time in what felt like days. She allowed herself to believe the bloodshed might be spared. When the dust began to settle, the guide climbed up from the creek. Soaked and furious, his pride broken more than his body, he shouted that they were fools, that the Apache would strike again, that mercy was weakness. But no one answered him. The settlers ignored his rage, and the Apache gave him no more than a cold stare. He had lost the power he once held in his words. His voice, once a spark for anger, now sounded thin and hollow against the quiet that followed. Her father rode close, his face dark with both fury and sorrow. He stopped his horse near her and glared down, his jaw trembling with unspoken words. At last he muttered, "You are not the daughter I thought you were." His voice was harsh, but his eyes betrayed the pain behind it. She met his gaze, steady, her own heart heavy. "I am still your daughter," she said softly, "but I will not hate what I have seen." He turned from her before she could say more, urging his horse after the others. She watched him go, knowing the road back to him would not be easy, perhaps not even possible. The settlers moved off, the sound of their departure fading into the dark. Only then did the warrior guide his horse nearer to her, his presence grounding her in the silence that followed. His eyes searched hers, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding. "You chose to stand," he said, his voice low. "Few would have done so." She looked at him, her throat tight. "I could not let either side destroy everything." He gave a single nod, the kind that carried both respect and a warning. "This night is not the end. The land still burns with anger. But you kept the fire from spreading." Back in the valley, the old man met them with his feathered staff in hand. He listened to the account without expression, his gaze lingering on her when the warrior spoke of her stand in the flats. At last he said, "Bridges are not easy paths. They carry weight and crack under storms. You must choose where you will stand and who you will carry." She bowed her head, the truth of his words heavy. She had not chosen sides fully yet, in case she knew she could no longer belong only to the world she had left behind. In the days that followed, the valley quieted. The settlers did not return, though watchfires burned each night. The cattle were kept to the lower bend, and the burial hill stood untouched beneath the stars. Still, the tension remained. Her father sent no word. The guide vanished from the fort, likely carrying his bitterness elsewhere. But in the silence that came after, she found herself lingering among the Apache. Learning their ways, seeing their children laugh, their women sing, their men hunt and ride. She discovered they were not shadows in the night, but people bound to the same earth as she. The warrior watched her carefully, never pressing, never turning away. They spoke more now, though his words were few. She learned his scars had stories, that his silence held weight. that his people lived each day with the knowledge that tomorrow might demand everything from them. And he, in turn, learned that she was not a spy, not a pawn of her father, but a woman searching for truth in a land full of lies, when the time came for her to leave. The old man walked with her to the ridge. He pointed to the horizon where the sun bled into the earth. "The land does not choose," he said. "Only men do. If there is to be peace, it will not come from the sky or the soil. It must come from those who carry the weight of both worlds." She nodded, feeling the truth settle deep within her. She returned once to the settlement, where her father greeted her with silence. Her mother wept, but did not speak. The men looked at her with suspicion, as though her time among the Apache had stripped her of loyalty. Yet she did not bend to their judgment. She knew what she had seen, and she knew where her heart leaned. Though she still lived among them, her thoughts carried her often back to the valley, to the people who had shown her both danger and dignity, and to the warrior whose eyes had held her steady when the world had nearly broken, seasons turned. The land did not soften, nor did the distrust vanish. But there were fewer raids that year, and fewer rifles fired at shadows. Sometimes she caught sight of a rider far on the horizon, watching, silent, a reminder that she was not forgotten. She carried that sight like a promise, fragile but real. In the end, the story of that night spread, told in whispers around fires and in low voices over meals. Some said the settlers turned back because of fear. Others said the Apache spared blood out of cunning, but those who had been there knew the truth. A single choice had held the line, a single voice had refused to break. She had stood as a bridge when the ground shook beneath her feet, and for that night at least, the land had been spared another scar. As the years passed, she would look back and know that she had chosen not simply between her father and the warrior, not even between settlers and Apache, but between hate and hope. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, she carried with her the memory of the desert that night, the dust, the fire in men's eyes, the thunder of hooves, and the silence that had followed. It reminded her always that peace, like the land, was never given. It had to be held, even when it trembled, even when it cracked, even when it cost everything, and as long as the stars burned above the mesas and the wind carried the scent of sage. She knew the story of that night would live on, not as war, not as surrender, but as a fragile moment when two worlds paused at the edge of destruction and chose for one breath to listen.